Be lifted high, be lifted high.
Hey, Shiloh family, Midweek Refuel. Tonight we're on Acts chapter 27, and we're going to continue following Paul's journey as he goes to Rome this time. Lots of challenges that they're facing as they're navigating the sea. Interesting that there's a lot of detail in this chapter about that. Not a lot of teaching in the chapter, but we will see some supernatural stuff that happens with Paul and Paul hearing from the Lord. So we'll draw some conclusions from that. But let me share my screen and we will read. And I'm going to read from the Passion Translation because I actually tried a version of this recording with the New American Standard, and it's fine. It just is a little bit sometimes hard to follow. So let's look at it here. When it was decided that we were to sail for Italy, Festus handed over Paul and a number of other prisoners to the custody of a Roman officer named Julius, a member of the imperial guard. We went on board a ship from the port of Adramyttium, easy for me to say, that was planning to stop at various ports along the coast of southwestern Turkey. We put out to sea and were accompanied by Aristarchus from Thessaloniki in Macedonia. The next day, we docked at Sidon, and Julius, being considerate of Paul, allowed him to disembark and be refreshed by his friends living there. From there we put out to sea, but because the winds were against us, we sailed under the lee. I'm not sure if that's a correct translation there, but they sailed under the cover of Cyprus. Maybe that's a different word for that. After sailing across the open sea of Cilicia and Pamphylia, we docked at the port of Myra in Lycia. While we were there, the commanding officer found an Egyptian ship from Alexandria that was bound for Italy, and he put us on board. While we made little headway for several days, and with difficulty we made it to Cnidus. The strong winds kept us from holding our course, so from there we sailed along the lee, apparently that is a word, of Crete. So under the cover of Crete, opposite Cap Salome. So that you can just see they're dealing with winds that were contrary. I read in one account that this was just after the Day of Atonement, so I don't know what time of year that was. I'd have to look that up. But apparently, during that time of year, there was a lot of not good sailing weather, and this is the time that they are trying to travel to Rome. So they're having difficulty. So let's look at verse 8. Hugging the coast, we struggled on to a place called Fair Havens near the town of Lasea. We remained there a long time until we passed the day of the Jewish fast. So that's the Day of Atonement. Paul advised the frightened sailors that they should not put out to sea in such dangerous weather, saying, Men, I can see that our voyage would be disastrous for us and bring great loss, not only to our ship and cargo, but also to our own lives. We should remain here. So in this instance, Paul is getting a prophetic word about what is going to happen. But, verse 11, the officer in charge was persuaded more by the ship's helmsman and captain than he was by Paul. So he was more putting weight more on those who had sailing experience than Paul's prophetic word. So the majority decided to put out to sea, since Fairhaven was an exposed harbor and not suitable to winter in. And they had hoped to somehow reach the Cretan port of Phoenicia, which was a more suitable port because it was facing south. When a gentle south breeze began to blow, they assumed they could make it. So they pulled up anchor and sailed close to Crete. But it wasn't long before the weather abruptly worsened and a storm of hurricane force called the Nor'easter tore across the island and blew us out to sea. The sailors weren't able to turn the ship into the wind, so they gave up and let it be driven by gale winds. So obviously, we're not dealing with motorized boats here. They were dependent on the wind. And so if the wind was blowing you in a direction that you didn't want to go, you were in trouble, even though you might have oars on the boat to direct you a certain way. You against hurricane force winds, you have very little chance. And so that's what they're dealing with here. Verse 16, I believe, as we passed to the lee of a small island called Cauda, We were barely able to get the ship's boat under control. So the crew hoisted the dinghy aboard. I'm sure that was not in the original language, but you get the idea. The sailors used ropes and cables to undergird the ship. Fearing they would run aground on the shoals of Syrtis, they lowered the drag anchor to slow its speed and let the ship be driven along. The next day, because of being battered severely by the storm, the sailors jettisoned the cargo, and by the third day, they even threw the ship's tackle and rigging overboard. After many days of seeing neither the sun nor the stars, and with the violent storm continuing to rage against us, all hope of ever getting through it alive was abandoned. After being without food for a long time, Paul stepped before them and said, Men, you should have obeyed me and avoided all this pain and suffering by not leaving Crete. Now listen to me. Don't be depressed, for no one will perish, only the ship will be lost. For God's angel visited me last night, and the angel of my God, the God I passionately serve, he came and stood in front of me and said, Don't be afraid, Paul. You are destined to stand trial before Caesar, and because of God's favor on you, he has given you the lives of everyone who is sailing with you. So, men, keep up your courage. I know that God will protect you, just as he told me that he would. But we must run aground on some island to be saved. On the 14th night of being tossed about the Adriatic Sea about midnight, the sailors sensed we were approaching land. So they took surroundings and discovered that the water was about 120 feet deep. After sailing a short distance, they again took soundings and found it was only 90 feet deep. Fearing we would be dashed against a rocky coast, they dropped four anchors from the stern and waited for the morning to come. Some sailors pretended to go down to drop the anchors from the bow when in fact they wanted to lower the lifeboat into the sea and escape abandoning ship. Paul said to the Roman officer and his soldiers, Unless they all stay together on board the ship, you have no chance of surviving. At that moment they heard this. The soldiers cut the ropes of the dinghy and it fell away. Just before daybreak, Paul urged everyone to eat. He said, Today marks 2 weeks full that you've been in fearful peril and hunger, unable to eat a thing. Now eat and be nourished, for you'll all come through this ordeal without a scratch. Then Paul took bread and gave thanks to God in front of them, broke it, and began to eat. There were 276 people who ate until they were filled and were strengthened and encouraged. After they were satisfied, they threw the grain to the sea and lightened the ship. Verse 39. When the daylight came, the soldiers or the sailors didn't recognize the land, but they noticed a cove with a sandy beach, so they decided to run the ship ashore. They cut away the anchors, leaving them in the sea, untied the ropes, holding the rudders, and hoisted the foresail to the breeze to head for the beach. But they drifted into the rocky shoals between two depths of sea, causing the ship to flounder still a distance from shore. The bow was struck fast, jammed on the rocks, while the stern was being smashed by the pounding of the surf. The soldiers wanted to kill all the prisoners to prevent them from escaping, but the Roman officer was determined to bring Paul safely through, so he foiled their attempts. And he commanded the prisoners and crew who could swim to jump overboard, and swim ashore. The rest all managed to survive by clinging to planks and broken pieces of the ship, so that everyone scrambled to the shore uninjured. Okay, so lots of information there, lots of detail about the story. What we can see from this is first and foremost, we see God speaking to Paul throughout this circumstance, sometimes telling him what was going to happen so that he could relay that to those who were in charge of the ship. Unfortunately, many times they did not respond to him, thinking that they would put more emphasis on those who were more skilled in their experience. And so they didn't listen to Paul. But Paul was right, of course, because he heard from God. And I think over time, they began to recognize that Paul had this gift, even though they were determined to get to the place that they were trying to go. But ultimately, they end up being shipwrecked. And you see God's provision all the way through as um, Paul is telling, or God is telling Paul what is going to happen, and exactly what God says is going to happen is happening. Go figure. Okay. So, what can we glean from that? Well, there's a couple things that I draw from this. that I think are important. A lot of times when we talk about hearing from the Lord and we talk about applying what we hear from the Lord, there's a tendency to think that everything is going to go correctly because we've heard from the Lord. But sometimes, as we see in this situation, God is telling us about what's going to happen. And it, I think, is a lot of times just preparing us so that we are not shocked by it. We're not living in fear, but He's prepared us for the difficulty that we're going to walk through. That's what I'm trying to say is often we think the prophetic is the solution to not going through difficulty, but sometimes the prophetic is there to help us in the place of difficulty, to tell us, keep faith, keep putting your trust in the Lord, keep anchoring yourself in His presence, and you're going to make it through whatever it is that you're going through. And we see that played out with Paul here. I think the other thing too is I see is to not get discouraged. Paul could have been discouraged because here he is offering information that they're not willing to take. They were looking at things solely from a natural perspective, and they weren't receiving what he was saying that he had heard from the Lord. And sometimes we get discouraged with those things, or we get angry, we get frustrated at people. But reality is, these are situations where we get to personally learn to hear from the Lord and see what He's doing. And so we can, as we hear from Him and we see what He's doing, it builds our faith and our ability to hear. But also, it helps us to be resilient in these moments, even when others are not responding. I've heard from the Lord. I'm anchored to His presence. I'm connected to Him. And so that is what gives me faith to go through the circumstances that I'm going through. And so that's what I see in this story, that Paul really had anchored himself to the presence of the Lord. It was something he was passionate about. It was something that he had purposed for his life work, was to hear from God and fulfill the purpose that God had on his life. And so in this situation, it helped him get through a really difficult time. And there's going to be in 28, you'll see more difficulties that he has to go through. So we're almost through, and we're learning about Paul's missionary journey. And there's things that we can learn from Paul that will help us in our own walk with the Lord. Here's my encouragement before we end. You hear from the Lord. Pay attention to what you're hearing from Him. So it's good to even journal what you're praying, journal what God is saying to you, so that when it does come about, you've got a record of what He said to you, and it just builds your faith in being able to hear from the Lord. Everybody can hear from Him because He's given us His Spirit, and so that we can connect with Him. But we have to pay attention so that we are growing in our confidence of hearing from the Lord. He's talking all the time. That's His name. He's the Word. And our job is just to listen. So there you go. That's Acts chapter 27. And next week we will finish the book of Acts with Acts chapter 28, go figure, and more on the story of Paul and his journeys.
Be lifted high, be lifted high.